all we're saying is that while, yes, indeed, the Israelis and the Zionists are guilty of tremendous crimes, even those crimes have to be attributed to their sponsors and to their backers and to the ones who are actually the architects of this entire thing, which is the Westerners. So what we are rejecting is the blame shifting, which does not mean then shifting accountability away from the Zionists, away from the Israelis for what they have done. I think it's very important to reiterate that and to emphasize that so that it can't be misinterpreted either ignorantly or willfully.
I just wanted to, I think that you had raised the question about the psychological impact on Jews as a result of their centuries of persecution, particularly in Europe, particularly in the West, since, of course, Westerners were much more vicious and much more prolific in their persecution of Jews than any other people. And then Brother MG was talking about the West's obsession with genetics and ethnicities. They were fascinated by this and obsessed with this in the 19th century and so forth. And I think that these two topics actually sort of can be tied together in that, and I think you alluded to it actually earlier, in fact, with regards to how Jews at various times in their history, religious Jews, because at that time in the early history of the Jews, in order to be a Jew, you had to be practicing Judaism. It was a religion. Now it was a community to a certain extent. They regarded themselves as a people, but it was a people defined by their religion, by their practicing of the religion. If a Jew became apostate, then he ceased being a Jew, regardless of what his bloodline may or may not have been. Being a Jew just meant that you were religious. Now, that's not what it meant in Europe, however. So you were talking about how sometimes the Jews, as a result of the persecution that they suffered, would compromise in their religion, and they would sort of taint their practice or whatever, and they would make concessions to try to win the favor of their oppressors, to try to assimilate with their oppressors as a way to sort of save themselves or protect themselves against the relentless persecution and oppression that they did in fact suffer historically. Well, they also tried to do that in Europe to one extent or another, and you have many who apostated from Judaism, became secular, became atheists. And in fact, the original, I won't get too much into it now, but of course the original founders of Zionism were atheists, and many of them, as I said in the video, are atheists today. So they are not Jew by religion anymore. They're not Jewish by religion anymore. But the thing with the Europeans, because they were so obsessed and continue to be so obsessed with what they call race or what they call ethnicity and so forth, and genetics, as brother said, they wouldn't let Jews not be Jews, even if they had left the religion. They still insisted to call Jews Jews, even if they were atheists and didn't even believe in God. But somehow they were still Jews because someone in their family line had been a practicing Jew. So they turned it into an ethnicity, even though even ethnically, even genetically, it didn't apply to the Jews that they were persecuting. Because as you said, we're talking about Europeans who had converted to Judaism. They weren't Semites, and they're not Semites. But they needed it to be a sort of a racial demographic. They needed to invent a racial demographic based on the historical identity, cultural, genetic identity of the Bani Israel. And in that way, they could ensure that Jews couldn't escape from persecution by changing their religion or becoming apostate. They needed to have a scapegoat. They needed to have someone to persecute, and the West always needs that. You know, they always talk about, like in America, America being this melting pot, and they're always telling people in Europe, immigrants in Europe, Muslims in Europe, religious people in Europe, all different types of people, that they need to assimilate. But the reality is they don't want you to assimilate, and in fact, they won't let you assimilate because they need to have an other who they can always pin their problems on, who they can always pin blame upon. Now, in Europe at that time, the Jews were the most viable target. So they wouldn't even let them not be Jews. They had to be Jews as defined by the society, regardless of what their religion was. Why, even if they had converted to Christianity, they'd still be Jews. As I say, even if they were atheists and didn't believe in God and were a godless people, it didn't matter to the European Christians. And it didn't matter even to the European atheists. All of this came out, by the way, after the Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, which is really when Europe entered one of its darkest periods, intellectually and morally, uh, when they insisted on racializing the Jews, and then the Jews themselves, because again, based upon their own history of persecution and their attempts to change and acquiesce and appease and assimilate to their oppressors, the Jews took upon themselves the definition of a Jew that was given to them by anti-Jewish hating Europeans, which is to say that they're still a Jew regardless of what their religious belief is or if they don't have a religious belief at all. So then even for the Jews themselves, being Jewish became an ethnic identity, even though under the misnomer of being a Semite, even though the Jews who took that title upon themselves and referred to themselves as Semites so that they could try to cope with anti-Semitism, they became this racialized identity. They ceased to regard themselves or to define themselves according to religion on the basis of not being defined according to their religion by anti-Semites, by European Christian bigots who insisted that they're Jews regardless of what their belief was.
You start viewing yourself as how they view you, right? So it's a very dangerous position that one can get into, and I think that this Jewish experience is
No, you're absolutely right. And with regards to Muslims in the West, and if Muslims in the West keep going the way that some of them are going, some members of the Muslim community in the West, if they keep going the way that they're going, and bending over backwards to the extent that some of them are in terms of trying to so-called assimilate with the West, why it won't be more than a few generations before you start to have people saying that they are atheist Muslims, the same way that you have atheist Jews. That 100 years ago, 200 years ago, not 100, 200 years ago, to refer to an atheist Jew would have been an oxymoron. There's no way that you could call yourself both an atheist and a Jew at the same time. That would have been something completely rejected by the Jewish community 200 years ago, 300 years ago, or what have you. But now it's regarded as perfectly normal. And you see, even they're trying to do it with Muslims in Europe. I don't know if they're doing it in the West, so in America so much, but in Europe, I know that they actually refer to anti-Muslim hatred as racial. They refer to Muslims as a race, which is the same thing that they did with the Jews. When, of course, Muslim is not a race. You can be any race, so-called race, if you already are insisting on believing the European obsession with genetics and so-called ethnicities and so forth, to even talk about races. If you already are accepting that, then you have to recognize that they're trying to do the same thing even with Muslims that they did with the Jews, which is to say that Muslims are a race. The same way that they said that Jews are a race, so it doesn't matter what their religion is. So eventually you could end up having someone actually seriously saying with a serious face that they're an atheist Muslim, or you might even reach the point of there being a Christian Muslim, because Muslim is a racial identity. They've turned it into a racial identity because you've accepted their definitions of things. They're completely confused and malicious definitions of things, which they're only defining in that way so that they can permanently ensure that they have some some community, some faction in their society on whom they can pin the blame for their own misdeeds and for their own problems. It sort of boggles the mind, and it's stunning, it's breathtaking, how insidious it is, how all of this developed and what it developed into. I mean, if you think about it, the Jews were persecuted in Europe, and they weren't given a way to escape that persecution in Europe, because, as I said, even if they tried to assimilate, even if they abandoned the religion of Judaism, Europe was still going to call them Jews, either way. No matter what they did, Europe would never let them not be Jews. So they were trying to escape this persecution. They persecuted them so badly to the point of this crescendo of violence in the Holocaust. And then they basically expelled them. They had a group of Jews. They had atheistic Jews who were so enamored by their oppressors, enamored by their persecutors, and thinking that they had to emulate their persecutors, and they came up with this political philosophy, this political theology of of Zionism, whereby they wanted to go to Palestine and build a homeland, so-called, meaning they wanted to colonize. They wanted to colonize Palestine. Westerners colonizing Palestine. But in this particular case, rather than it being the sort of official representatives of the Western world, of the colonizing countries, rather than it being the accepted official citizens, it was the persecuted citizens. It was the victims of that so-called civilization who they persecuted so badly, so brutally, so savagely in their own lands that then they sent them out to colonize on their behalf in the Muslim world, colonize Palestine on their behalf. This is so insidious. It occurs to me that the most dangerous thing that you can have in relation to the Westerners, I mean, generally speaking, it's one of the most dangerous things you can have, but particularly in relation to Westerners, to Western so-called civilization, and to those who are oppressing you. The worst and most dangerous quality that you can have is an inferiority complex. Because then you will try to assimilate with the people who are oppressing you. You'll try to appease them, you'll try to acquiesce to them, and you'll try to emulate them, and you'll try to be like them. But they will still never accept you. And you are now integrating into your own psyche their paradigms, their worldview, their definitions, their perspectives, and in their worldview, in their paradigms, in their perspectives, in their definitions, you are inferior. So you are now integrating into your own mindset, your own inferiority, according to the definitions of those who are persecuting and oppressing you. Because they'll never let you, just like they didn't let the Jews, they'll never let you actually stop being defined as the other. They'll never let you stop being defined as an outsider. They'll never let you stop being defined as a so-called minority. So the more you try to assimilate with them, the more you undermine and poison your own understanding of yourself. And then you have to try to seek some way, as a human being, the normal human nature, to try to find some way to assert yourself and find value. And you've learned from your oppressor that the way to assert your value is to oppress others, is to be brutal, is to do it the same way that they did against you. And that's exactly what they're doing. That's exactly what the Zionists did when they went to Palestine and behaved exactly like the people who persecuted them. Exactly. To a T. The Zionists are behaving and have the same mindset, the same mentality, exactly like the Nazis. They adopted that same mindset because it had been done to them. It's just like, if you put it down on a micro level, it's just like with abuse in a relationship, abuse of a child who grows up to be an abuser. The same sort of a cycle happens with nations. It happens with people. It happens on a macro scale. And that's exactly what happened with the Jews and with the invention of Zionism, which was just a tool of Western colonization in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, colonization of Palestine, but being carried out by the victims of Western so-called civilization. It's really insidious. You can barely wrap your head around how wicked it is. The Jews at any time, those European Jews, this is an irony, because the Europeans wouldn't let them assimilate, no matter how much they did assimilate, and they fully assimilated. I'm talking about like the ones who actually repudiated Judaism itself, repudiated religion, and became atheists. That's a full assimilation. You can't really assimilate more than that, than to become godless like the people in the society that's godless. They did everything that they could to try to be like them. But again, as I say, they wouldn't let them. And the extent to which they were assimilated, the extent to which, because we're talking again about people who were not actually Semites. We're talking about people who were not actually Bani Israel. We're talking about Europeans who had converted to Judaism and then, through the persecution that they suffered, repudiated Judaism and invented Zionism and went to Palestine. These are people, the Jews, the actual Jews in Europe, could have gone to Palestine at any time when it was under the Muslims. When it was under the Ottoman Empire, there were Jews already there. And there were Jews who could go there. You could go there freely There's no problem. If you want to go and live in Palestine, you can go. But the point is that you're so European that it doesn't even appeal to you to be in Palestine. And when you go to Palestine, you try to remake it into another Europe. You try to turn it into a Western country. That's how assimilated you were with Europe. That's how European you truly were. If you go there, and unfortunately I had to go there in order to go to Gaza, I had to go through there. It looks like a Western country. It doesn't look like the Middle East when you're in Israel. It doesn't look like, because I've been to many Arab countries, I've been to many countries in the Middle East, and Israel looks like you're in Europe. So they can't even assimilate to the culture that they pretend to come from. They can't even assimilate to the land and to the region that they pretend to come from, because they don't come from there. They're Europeans, but Europeans wouldn't accept them, and they kicked them out, because the only way to get them out was to kick them out, because they had no inclination to go live in Palestine to begin with, because as I said, they could have gone at any time.
Like, they didn't come to go back to where, like to go back to their heritage or their culture or like the land where they belong. No, they came and they brought Europe with them, right?
Precisely. Precisely. And the if they had been religious Jews, they probably would have been able to fit in. And they probably would have actually tried to integrate and assimilate with the Palestinians, because, as I said, there were Jews living in Palestine at that time, and they got along with the Palestinians. They saw them as their neighbors and their fellow citizens and so forth. And in fact, the Zionists didn't get along with those Jews. When the Zionists came to Palestine, there were clashes between them and what you can call indigenous Jews of Palestine. And if they had been religious Jews instead of atheistic Zionist Jews who defined Judaism or defined Jewishness according to the Western anti-Jewish hatred-based bigotry of being a racial identity instead of a religious identity, if they hadn't had that mindset, then when they came to Palestine, they would have integrated with the Palestinians rather than being this very insulated community of immigrants who cut the Palestinians off, who cut them out, and who aggressively and violently took over land. If they had been actually religious Jews, they might have been able to integrate. So if they had actually been following a religious claim or a religious motivation, then they probably would have been able to integrate peacefully with the Palestinians, the same way the Jews had always integrated with the Muslims in any part of the world. Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned how they're in conflict, continuous conflict, and then they have peace talks or whatever, what have you. This is why this is their function. This is the function of Zionism. This is the function of Israel. It was never actually intended to be a homeland, a safe, secure, stable homeland for the Jewish people, because if that had ever been the intention, then they wouldn't have gone there and behaved the way that they behaved. Like I said, they would have gone there and integrated with the Palestinians. They would have lived there peacefully with the indigenous people. But this is why we say it's a colonizer project. It's a colonial colonizer project whose function is destabilization. And as long as they remain sponsored by, backed by, and controlled by or directed by the Western powers, that's the only thing that it ever will be. And the only way that there can actually be any sort of real security or stability is if it loses that function, if so-called Israel loses that function for the West, and loses this, and the only way that they'll lose their function for the West is if they stop serving the West and stop being sponsored by the West, and take a new sponsor and integrate into the region. That's the only way that they can ever stop being a violent, disruptive element in the region, because that has been their function. It's a colonizing Western colonial project and always has been. So it's not because as I said, if the Westerners first of all admit to themselves their anti-Jewish hatred and say, well, we can't be rehabilitated from our anti-Jewish hatred, and we need these poor innocent Jews to be saved from our persecution. Let's let them go to Palestine of their own free will, and then let them integrate with the population and follow the natural way of immigration and assimilation with the population. Encourage them or require them to do the same thing in Palestine that we insist immigrants do when they come to our lands, which is to assimilate and integrate. If we encourage the Jews to do that in Palestine, well, then they could have safety and security and stability. But that has never been what the West wanted. That's never been their program. And that's why they advocated for and supported and backed Zionism from the beginning. Because not only did they want to get the Jews out of Europe, the ones that they defined as Jews, who, as I say before, historically would not have been defined as Jews because they're not religious. But not only did they want to get the Jews out of Europe, they wanted to be able to use those Jews to colonize and disrupt the Muslim world.
Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen, Iraq, there were Jews everywhere. But from the time of the Umayyads and the Abbasids on until the expulsion from Spain, Jews, they enjoyed really equal citizen rights with their Muslim brethren. So yeah, I don't want to go on and on about this, but history is on the side of Muslims being the Jews' greatest protectors. So that's that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, there were examples in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam where certain Jews were punished, but they were punished for their actions, for their misdeeds, for their wrongdoing. The Jews under the Muslims were never singled out for any mistreatment or any persecution on the basis of them being Jews. That never happened. They were punished for wrongdoing the same as anybody else. And you mentioned how before 1947 you could find Jews in all different parts of the Muslim world. And I've seen some people claim as some sort of an argument in favor of the idea that Muslims persecute Jews, to say, well, why aren't there more Jews, or why aren't there any Jews in the Muslim countries? First of all, it's not true. There still are many Jews throughout the Muslim world, throughout the Arab world. There's even Jews right now in Afghanistan, of all places. But the reason why there are fewer Jews now is precisely because the Israelis were desperate for immigration, for what they call aliyah, to bring more Jews into the occupation of Palestine. So the ones who are responsible for the decrease in the number of Jews in the Muslim world isn't the Muslims, it's the Zionists, who incentivized and who recruited Jews from all around the world. Israel is the one who's responsible. The Zionists are the ones who are responsible for any Jews not living, or for Jews not living in the Muslim world or in any other countries. They're the ones who are responsible for that, not because of their persecution in the Muslim world, which isn't the thing that happened.
Ummatan wasata. We are a middle nation, so try to uphold what Allah has said about us. And there is a great sentence from one of the videos of Brother Shahid, learn about the Jews from what the Quran says and not what Mein Kampf says, right? So please take this to heart and understand reality for what it is. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, so now, yes, sir.
No, I was just going to sort of second what you were saying, with regards to the Jews being. I mean, you mentioned how the Jews are our cousins, and I mentioned that also. But of course, I'm talking about Jews who we would define as Jews, which means that they're the believers in Judaism, the people who actually follow the religion of Judaism, or who are from the actual Bani Israel, who are what the Europeans would call Semites because of their obsession with genealogy and ethnicity and race and so forth. That disqualifies the majority of Israelis as being Jews. According to Islamic understanding of what a Jew is, the overwhelming majority of Israelis are not religious people. Many of them are atheists. Netanyahu is not a religious Jew. Even this Ben Gvir and so forth, and all of these people who claim to be these ultra-Orthodox, hardcore Jews and what have you, they act and speak in contradiction with Judaism. And in fact, the Orthodox Jew community, the Orthodox Jewish community, who are actually serious about their religion, which I also don't want to make any misunderstanding to say that we approve of Judaism, because they're supposed to be Muslims. But at the end of the day, they do believe in a faith. They do have a faith. So if they don't have a faith, then we wouldn't call them Jews. They don't qualify as Jews. And if they're Europeans, they're certainly not Bani Israel. So we should call them what they are. This is an important distinction to make, because the Westerners trying to blame shift, trying to save themselves from their own accountability, want to say the people who pretend to be pro-Palestinian, like that Armenian who went viral a few weeks ago, they want to blame Jews and Judaism for the crimes of Israel. So we have to make a distinction. Again, as Ummatun Wasata, as a people who are obligated to tell the truth, whether it's for us or against us, to tell the truth no matter what it is, we have to tell the truth. And the people who are committing most of the crimes, most of the people who are committing the crimes, who are committing the genocide, who are overseeing the occupation, the land seizures, the murder, the famine, all of the violence and all of the atrocities and monstrosities that are being committed against the Palestinian people, most of the people who are doing that are not Jews by our definition, and they're not doing it because they're motivated by a religious faith in Judaism. Even you'll see the absurdity of an Israeli who's asked if they believe in God, and they'll say no, but why do you think you should be in Palestine? Because God gave us the land. We've all heard that before, that you have these people who don't believe in God, but somehow believe in the promise of God that the land is for them. It's an absurdity. So according to our understanding, most of these people are not Jews. So we have to call them what they are, which is Western colonizers. That's what they are, Western colonizers. And the Westerners would hate for us to make that distinction, because that puts the blame squarely where it belongs, which is on their shoulders. They want us to not see that. They want us to not recognize that, because as always, they can't take responsibility for their own evil, for their own brutality, for their own savagery and wickedness. They want to put it all on the Jews. And they think that Muslims are going to be so emotional and so uneducated about our own history and about our own faith that we'll go along with that. And unfortunately, there are some Muslims who will go along with that because they are that ignorant about our history and they are that ignorant about our own faith. And usually you'll find that those are the Muslims who are coming from the West and have become that ignorant about our own history and about our own faith because they're trying to assimilate, as the Jews did in Europe. They're trying to assimilate with the Western colonial powers, with Western imperialists, and with Western oppressors and persecutors of anyone and everyone who isn't them and who isn't like them. So we must, as Ummatun Wasata, as a middle nation, we have to make a distinction and tell the truth and speak in justice and with justice about all situations. And we have to put the blame where it lies, and say specifically and accurately that what is happening in Gaza, what's happening in Palestine, is being committed and being perpetrated by the West. You have the Zionists are nothing but a brigade of Western imperialism. It's nothing but a brigade of Western colonization, and we can't let them off the hook for what they've done, and let them shift the blame for their actions to the Jews, and to say that it's all about the Jews and this is just how they are because they're evil and so forth. Because that's exactly the same kind of hatred and bigotry that caused this whole problem in the first place. Because you treated the Jews that way, you made the Jews a certain kind of way, you made them compromise, you made them seek to assimilate with you in your evil and your violence and your brutality, and you turned them into what they are now, and then you sent them to attack us. So we can't go along with that. We have to call things what they are and define things according to how they actually are, and put the blame where it properly lies. Thank you, brother. Can I just add something? First, no offense, but I sort of recoil at saying that we don't want to alienate any good Jews because we need them on our side. We don't need anyone on our side. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is on our side, but what we have to do is be on the side of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have to be on the side of the truth, and we have to speak truth and speak justice, regardless. We're not looking to win the favor of anyone except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so we have to tell the truth, and that's why we have to tell the truth. And then the other thing I was going to say is, it's indicative of what I was talking about earlier, this inferiority complex and how dangerous the inferiority complex is. It's indicative of an inferiority complex when you see Muslims going along with Western anti-Jewish hatred, when they do to the Jews the same thing that they do to us when it's convenient for them, which is, as you were talking about, where they'll take when they're attacking us, when they'll take an ayah out of context, when they'll take a hadith out of context or some historical incident from the seerah out of context, and then we have to spend all sorts of effort to try to provide the context when it's actually absurd and ridiculous and irresponsible and deceitful to make a claim about anyone's religion. Anyone's religion. It doesn't matter what it is. To make a claim about anyone's religion and think that you can define that religion by one or two sentences that you cherry pick from their scripture or from their books of jurisprudence or what have you, or from their history, and think that that defines the religion, and think that you can talk authoritatively about someone else's religion when you're not a scholar of that religion. We know perfectly well what that feels like. But then what I'm talking about in terms of the how indicative it is of an inferiority complex is when we go along with it as long as they're doing it to someone else. As long as they're doing it to the Jews, for example, or if they're doing it to the Hindus. We're just happy that they're not doing it to us. So we'll go along with it. We like the bully to bully someone else instead of bullying us. So we actually go along with it and we participate in it. And that's a form of trying to curry favor with the very bully who you have always been persecuted by yourself. And that's coming from that same inferiority complex that I was talking about. And that's exactly the inferiority complex that caused the Jews in Europe to abandon their own religion, to abandon their own religious principles, and to become atheists, and to then emulate their the brutality of their oppressors. And we don't need that to happen to us. We have to follow our deen properly and effectively and correctly. We have to follow our deen correctly. Which means that we can't go along with something that's unfair and unjust and deceitful just because it's being targeted against a people who, a section of those people are our enemies.